Donald Trump is a loser. After 4 days of waiting, it was confirmed last night that Trump had lost the US election and that Joe Biden had won to become the 46th person to be president-elect. I'm sure everyone watching tonight, and I can see there's hundreds of you already, I'm sure everyone watching will be delighted to see a loss for Donald Trump. After 4 years of racism, sexism, bigotry, transphobia, we can all savour a defeat for Trump. And while we celebrate his defeat, we can prepare for the battles that will lie ahead against a Biden presidency. Biden's record, his politics, and his campaign shows that we have much to do to not just fight Trumpism, but also fight for the better world that we all crave. Tonight, on this SWP TV US election special, we're going to be going behind the headlines. We're going to be exploring and trying to understand what lay behind the election result, where it leaves us now, and where the left can go from here. And I'm delighted to say that to do that, we are joined by a fantastic panel live from the States. We're going to be joined by August Nimtz. August is a political scientist and a professor of African American studies at the University of Minnesota. So welcome, August. Thanks a lot for joining us. We're also going to be joined by Virginia Rodino. Virginia, amongst many other things, is an activist with March 21 in the States, our sister organization with over there, and she's also the co-chair of Maryland Green Party. So welcome, Virginia, who's joining us from Baltimore. And we're also, last but not least, going to be joined by Paul LeBlanc. Paul is a long-time activist, long-time socialist, and he's an author of many books, including books on Lenin, on Rosa Luxemburg, and a short history of the workers' movement in the States. So welcome, Paul, who's joining us from Pittsburgh in Pennsylvania. And I have to say, Paul, I'm glad you're here. At one point, I thought the Pennsylvania vote might never come through. But it's great to have all three of those panelists with us here tonight. And there's one more panelist who's joining us, and that's you at home. I can see there's hundreds of you watching already. We want you to take part in this discussion. Please do keep your comments coming, your questions, your disagreements, whatever you want raised. If you are watching on Facebook, type your comments in the chat. If you're watching on YouTube, do the same. Remember to like the video, remember to share it, and remember to subscribe for future events. We want to get as many people watching this as possible, so please do press that share button on your screen right now. Without further ado, I'm going to get started and go straight into it. And I want to start with the question of Trump's defeat. And I'm going to bring Virginia in on this question to start with. We'll go on to Biden a bit later, and the lack of illusions we can have in someone like Joe Biden. But firstly, I want to start with Trump's defeat, because a defeat for Trump is a defeat for racists, for the far right, for the fascists everywhere. And I want to ask you, Virginia, really, after 4 years of Trump, what does his defeat mean for the left? And I know there's some confusion whether he'll even accept the result and, what might happen over the next 2 months. But how do you think the left should respond to the fact that he was defeated in the election last week?
Yeah, thanks, Louis, and thanks for having me on this panel. I'm glad to be here speaking to all of you and with Paul and August. Trump's threat to challenge the results and to illegally occupy the White House, his threats to do that, were met with a galvanization of hundreds of liberal and progressive groups across the country, including labor and the movement for Black Lives, saying that they were going to protect the results. So throughout the past week and through the next week, including right now as we speak, people are in the streets, both celebrating and demanding that every vote count. So there is a wave of celebration by liberals who have lifted up Biden and Harris throughout the entire race. There is a sigh of relief by most of the left, since Trump is such a horror show. But for revolutionary socialists, there's a moment of pause, a moment to breathe, and a need to determine our next steps. And here's why. While liberals in the left still hold Obama as an extra-worldly being, we know that upon his election, the brilliant anti-war movement was laid to rest. We recently saw Obama break the strikes of the Black basketball players who were protesting yet another police murder of another Black man. We saw Biden lift it to victory through the votes of activists who had just a couple of months previously had been marching in the streets to defund the police and demand that Black lives matter. And yet we saw Biden respond by arguing that police should receive an additional $300 million in funding. So while it is a wonderful moment for the world that Trump is no longer in the White House, our challenge now is how to hold a Biden presidency accountable and not let our movements for change wilt and go into hibernation or become complacent through trust in the Democrats.
Thanks, Virginia. I want to come back to that question of what a Biden presidency means in a moment. But first, I want to raise the question of Trump's vote in the election. Watching from Britain, it seems quite remarkable that he managed to increase his vote by almost around 8 million, I think. And I want to turn to August on this question, August Nimtz. Because I want to ask why this is. You know, he's seen his vote go up by 8 million on his 2016 vote. And, you know, I'm sure people watching at home would have the same experience as me. I've seen, you know, lots of people putting on social media saying that, you know, this shows that America's just, you know, full of stupid racists and so on. Now, there might be some stupid racists. I think it's a bit unfortunate to write off, you know, the whole of American white working class as racist and so on. But clearly, in this election, despite the predictions of a landslide victory for Biden and so on, clearly Trump's message of the economy and his nasty racism was able to connect very powerfully with a lot of working class people in the States. And, you know, I really want to come to August on this. Why do you think that is? Despite, you know, 230,000 dead from the COVID crisis, despite all the, you know, scandal and stuff we've seen over the last 4 years, August, why do you think it is that Trump was able to get an even bigger vote than he was in 2016?
Well, thanks, Louis, for inviting me. I think what happened in this election was a replay in some ways of the previous election, 2016, that is economics. If you look at exit polls, both of the exit polls for the election, the economy was at the center of most people's, the majority, if not a majority, a plurality of people's concerns. And we got to remember that in this time, we're in a deep economic crisis, and working people are facing a very, very precarious situation. So it's no surprise that working people would be most concerned with the economy. And the fact is that the Biden administration, the Biden campaign didn't really have a concrete economic program to offer as a solution. And Trump was able to replay his card from 2016. Elect me and I will save you. And he was able to convince enough working people of that claim. Of course, it's a false claim, but as Karl Marx once said, that a drowning person will grab hold to a twig if they think it will save them. And that's what he was able to do in his campaign. And leading up to the election itself, you could see the enthusiasm and the mobilizations and the rallies he was holding, that this would, he would be able to mobilize and enthuse his base in a way that Biden was not able to enthuse people. And it's my feeling, had this campaign lasted 3 more days, or another week and so on, that Trump may have been able to pull this off.
Yeah, it's interesting you raised that, August, about, you know, if the campaign had lasted longer. One of the things that stood out, and I don't know how much we can believe the statistics. But one of the things that I think a lot of people have been quite shocked at is that Trump has even increased his vote amongst black voters and amongst Latinos. How do you think we can explain that? Because, the black vote is something which is often talked about in US politics. Obviously, Biden, and the Democrats have taken it for granted for so many years. How can we explain that, Trump convinced a higher proportion of black and Latino voters to vote for him this time around than he did 4 years ago?
Well, it's a reflection of a fact that too many of us who are progressive people tend to essentialize black people. We tend to essentialize Latino. These are categories and social constructs. And the Latinx vote, I think, is especially interesting. There's a Wall Street Journal article yesterday about the jobs crisis and the latest jobs figures. Latino men have been doing pretty good, actually, over the course of in this last 3 or 4 months. If you're working in construction, in certain kinds of jobs and so on, many Latino men were doing quite well. And so if the economy is of your major concern, you are likely to attribute this to the fact that Trump was in office. And so he was able to play upon that. And within the African-American community, there are class divisions there are certain African-American men, especially there, who look to Trump as a model. And that reflects the class differences within the working class, along skin color lines. Yeah, the vote for the Latino vote, especially in Texas, down in the Rio Grande Valley, you had counties, majority counties in the Rio Grande Valley that are Mexican American that went for Trump. And so again, if we don't deal with the reality of the class realities within these communities that we put these labels on, we will miss this. And so the problem fundamentally, though, and let me conclude at least this portion, the fundamental problem is that the working class doesn't have its own political party. And this is what working people get trapped into, either the Democrats or the Republicans. In my opinion, that's the fundamental lesson we should take away from this. What happens when the working class does not have its own political party? It's forced into these false choices between the Democrats and Republicans, people who are pretending to be in favor of the working class. And until we get our own political party, always remember the United States is the only advanced capitalist country where the working class does not have its own political party.
It's interesting you say that, August, and we're going to return to that point in a bit about the question of political representation. But I can see that Sarah's written in the chat on Facebook saying that August is right. Americans work long hours, have very short holidays, and almost no safety net. I think the vote for Trump there must reflect a level of desperation for something different from the usual brutality of capitalism. So thanks for that comment, Sarah. And just to announce that there's over 500 people tuning into this live. We're live on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and Instagram. So if you are watching, keep your comments coming, keep your questions coming, and please do click that share button so we can reach more people. Following on from what August just said, I'm going to come to Paul LeBlanc now, who's based in Pittsburgh in Pennsylvania. Paul, given what August said about the scale of the working class vote for Trump, I want to really ask, what does this mean for the right in America? Trump may be gone or may refuse to, but he certainly lost the election. But clearly this isn't the end of Trumpism. What does it mean, not just for the Republican Party, who, he's very much remolded in his own image. It's very unlikely the Republican Party is going to go back to the days of, John McCain or Mitt Romney and so on. The Republican Party seems very captured by the radical right and the racist right. But what does the scale of his vote mean for the Republicans, but also for the sort of far right groups that he's encouraged, and then also for working class people who support him? So I'm going to ask you that question, Paul. I realize there's a lot to unpack there, but give us your thoughts on that.
Sure, and I'd like to pack a little more in. I want to pull in the question that, or the ideas that Sarah articulated on the chat. I think we've got to look at this whole thing in a certain context. there is a crisis. There's a set of crises that have been developing in slow motion, but with increasing acceleration in capitalist society, certainly in the United States. The quality of life has been deteriorating. It has an environmental component. It has various components, but people have been feeling this and experiencing this over a period of years. Mainstream politicians of both the Democratic and the Republican Party have been strong defenders of capitalism and have put forward all kinds of nice and not so nice rhetoric and promises and other things that have not been addressing what's happening to people, so that there's a growing desperation and a growing fear among more and more people, and a radicalization is taking place. And a growing lack of willingness to simply settle for politics as usual. What Trump represents is a break from politics as usual. He's gone deeper than just the moderate platitudes that many politicians have articulated. And he's tapping into fear and anxiety and resentment and anger and rage and getting a response. He's not the typical politician. That's going to happen to the extent that there isn't a serious and effective left-wing alternative. So what's going to happen with the right, in part, is dependent on what the left is going to be able to do. In my opinion, the left is very weak. There's a strong tendency to tail the Democratic Party. There is not the kind of independent working class party that August has talked about the need for. We are far from that. So one question is, when and how is the left going to get its act together? And that will impact on the question of what happens with the right. I think another issue is things are very fluid right now and very complex. So the Republican Party, there are differences in the Republican Party. There are fissures that have been sort of papered over, but are emerging. To what extent is Trump going to, find the kinds of defenders and enablers in the Republican Party that he was counting on for the past 4 years? I think that may be starting to break up. At the same time, there is a continued rage and anger and fear among many working class people and others that is being spoken to by the extreme right. So I think that there's that danger and that question but that has to be understood and discussed in context. I want to end on one thought, and that is the working class. When we're talking about the working class and the working class vote and so on, the working class is the majority class in this country. The majority of the people who voted for Trump and for Biden are part of the working class. There are different segments of the working class. In one of the questions that you raised, that you sent out to the speakers, has racism permeated the white working class? Oh, yes, from the very beginning. That has been part of American history, and that's an issue that we must deal with. So one question is, how can we cut across that? How can we on the left help to cut across that and develop a class consciousness that can cut across that kind of racism? So it seems to me that's another challenge for those of us who are wrestling with the kinds of questions that you're posing, especially those of us on the left.
What you just said there, Paul, and what August said, I think is really important, because here in Britain, it's been quite frustrating that no one really in the liberal media or in the mainstream media have been able to offer a coherent understanding of what Trumpism represented. You know, as someone who could pose as an outsider and feed on a deep and bitterness and anger, within working class people. I'm going to come back to August on this question. Who are the kind of people who are voting for Trump? And second question for you, August, if you can fit it in, on Paul's point about what do we do about, white working class people who are who have been taken in by Trump's racism. So, what is who are the people who are voting for Trump, and how can we try and win them away from that kind of politics? I want to put that question to you, August.
Yes, no, thanks for allowing me to comment on that. Looking at the exit polls, both the AP Votecast and also the Edison poll, New York Times Edison poll, Trump voters are not the most deprived, the most oppressed workers in the United States. It's not. It's a layer of workers who are more privileged, income levels, according to one of those polls, above $100,000 per year. These are clearly not. This is not the working class, the most oppressed layers within the working class who are voting for Trump. And they're much more likely to be parts of the working class there who are more privileged and who have middle class aspirations. That's my reading of the exit poll data. Yeah, and about the racism within the working class, the so-called racism within the working class. As a 78-year-old African-American male, I'm here to testify, believe me, there's less racism within the working class than there was, at least certainly during the time when I came into politics in the 1950s and 1960s, exactly because of the gains of the civil rights movement in the 1960s. And I think that's reflected in the attitudes around the police. One of the polls actually looks at the Black Lives Matter question, and it reveals that actually Black Lives Matter has a much better image now than it had before the 2020 election, certainly before the 2016 election, and that is something that we have to take into account. And the question of the police. You remember, one of the things that Trump tried to do was to play the law and order, that is to promote white backlash to the anti-police brutality protest. The data indicates that didn't work. That certainly didn't work here in Minnesota, where he lost the state of Minnesota. Remember, Minnesota is where the protests began, and the Republicans tried to play the white backlash card, and it did not work. It did not work in the predominantly white suburbs. In some of the exurbs, yes, but in the predominantly white suburbs, it simply didn't work. Whereas in 1968, when Richard Nixon played the white backlash card, he was able to win the White House. But that's not the case today. And most people recognize now, 75% of the people who are polled recognize that blacks are discriminated by the police. And so that's an advance. That's an advance over what attitudes were before the George Floyd movements. And I can't emphasize enough, as a participant, and again, as someone who's participated in anti-police brutality marches going back to the 1960s, what was so striking about the United States was the multiracial character of these marches. 20 to 25 million people. In the 1960s, when we had anti-police brutality marches, they were exclusively African American. In fact, if you were white, you sometimes took your life put your life in risk to even be around those protests. That's not the case anymore. And I can't say enough about that, because sometimes we take it for granted, especially young people who involved in these marches, take it for granted that they've always been multiracial. No. That simply is not the case. And we have to understand the significance of that development. So that's a part of my argument about why the United States is a less racist country than it's ever been, exactly because of the racial composition of the protests.
It's fascinating to hear that, August. It links to a question that has been asked in the chat, which I'm going to put to Virginia, and others can come in on it if they'd like to as well. There's a question in the chat from Alex, who's watching from Newcastle, which for those in America is in the north of England. Alex asks, will the Democrats feel pressured by movements like Black Lives Matter voting in Biden to make concessions, or will they move to the right to appeal to Trump voters? And this is what I wanted to come to and ask you, Virginia, which is, you know, August touched on it. What is the relationship between the Black Lives Matter protests that we saw and how that impacted not just on Biden's vote and the Biden campaign, but how did that impact on Trump's vote? Because it's easy to forget, but, you know, it's only 4 or 5 months ago that you see an inspirational movement on the streets. You know, the New York Times, I think, said it was one of the biggest mass movements in American history, 26 million people taking part. You know, real radical demands coming out of that about abolish the police and so on, shifting social attitudes and so on. Where does Black Lives Matter fit in with all of this in terms of the impact on the Democrats and Biden, but also in terms of pointing a way to defeat some of, you know, the Trump and Trumpism that we talked about? So what are your thoughts on that, Virginia?
Yeah, I think all of those people who marched for the movement for Black Lives a couple of months ago did go and vote for Biden. And they did because Trump was just so anti-movement, anti-people's movement. He was so pro-police from the start. We saw this from when he was campaigning in 2016. And in our two-party system here in the States, there isn't much of an alternative choice if you don't want the candidate who makes excuses for the Nazis who are murdering protesters, who makes excuses for the police who are murdering Black people. So the Movement for Black Lives began an initiative called the Movement for Black Lives Electoral Justice Project. And that initiative has committed to projects, both electoral and non-electoral. So we need to win the arguments at these sorts of tables to keep marching, to keep protesting, to keep pressuring so that the movement does not become bureaucratized and channeled into only propping up politicians. We need the movement to maintain its strength from people on the streets, because that's where their real strength lies. But, you know, absolutely, the multiracial masses of American citizens, including hundreds of thousands of young people, absolutely went and they voted for Biden. A small portion of them, like myself, voted for the eco-socialist Green Party candidates, but by and large, the movements helped carry Biden and Harris to victory. They would not have won without them. But I think throughout our recent history, we can definitely see that the Democrats take their voters for granted. Unfortunately, the Democratic Party is where movements go to die. And we see this. It's not a logical next step for them. They don't look at the Sanders campaigns, both of them, and say, maybe our constituents want more economic and social equality. Maybe we should rethink our platforms and our policies and our work. They don't see the re-elections of the squad, including AOC, as an indication that more leftist politics is what they should embrace. Instead, we see them looking for ways to silence and even to rid themselves of their more radical members, because they desperately want to maintain the status quo. They desperately need to. It's self-preservation as a capitalist party, which is what they are. So to answer the other question that came up, to answer the DSA question, in terms of what are the possibilities of a leftist party forming that represents better the workers. I mean, the DSA itself may be pulled more to the left. It may be won over by arguments that it should be less dependent on reforming the Democratic Party, which they very much are invested in. And you can see their reactions to the down ballot campaigns that they endorsed and supported and phone banked for, and they were applauding those. But really, the critical turn for leftists in the United States is when we don't rely solely and principally on electing politicians to make the societal change we need. We need to focus on building up real people power and connecting the mass movements to bring about the change that we're demanding in the streets.
It's interesting you say that, Virginia. And Virginia, I think, was responding to a question in the chat from Kevin on Facebook, who was asking, can the DSA, the Democratic Socialists of America, detach itself and mobilize as a potential party of the left in the USA? If you are watching, please do keep your questions and your comments coming. There's over 600 of you watching so far. So do click like, click share, leave your comments, subscribe for future videos, and so on. I want to revisit the question of what the left does in a second, but as a way into that, I want to try and understand what happened with the Biden campaign. Because Biden has obviously won the election, but it was quite an underwhelming performance, I think would be fair to say. Right up until election day, there were commentators writing pieces, you know, people on news channels and polls suggesting that Biden was heading for a landslide victory. That hasn't yet materialized. The states that he has managed to flip, he's done so on a very fine margin. And it really raises the question, I think, what to expect from a Biden presidency. You know, the Democrats had hopes of winning the Senate and increasing their majority in the House of Representatives. They've done neither. Before I'm going to turn to August in this question, but before I do, I just want to show a clip. Can we get this clip up of Biden, part of his victory speech last night in Delaware, I believe, if we can get that clip.
For all those of you who voted for President Trump, I understand the disappointment tonight. I've lost a couple times myself, but now let's give each other a chance. It's time to put away the harsh rhetoric, lower the temperature, see each other again, listen to each other again. And to make progress, we have to stop treating our opponents as our enemies. They are not our enemies, they are Americans. They're Americans. The Bible tells us, to everything there is a season, a time to build, a time to reap and a time to sow, and a time to heal. This is the time to heal in America.
That's Joe Biden there, looking a bit worse for wear, as you might expect a 78-year-old candidate to look like. I want to bring August in now, August Nimtz, on the question of Biden, because if we go back to January, February of this year, you know, during the primary campaign for the Democrats, you see the Democrat elite really pile in to make sure that Biden wins the candidacy. And what we're told is that he would be the safe candidate, that he'd be the person who was best placed to beat Trump. You then see that he runs a very weak campaign. I wanted to get your thoughts, August, on his campaign, and not just what it says about Biden as an individual, which we'll come to in a second, but really, what does it say about the weakness of the liberal centre? You know, faced with a populist challenge from the right, the idea that Biden is just really going to scrape home when people have predicted a landslide. What are your thoughts on that, August? Well,
Contrary to what the polls claimed, I was one of those people who thought that in fact, 3 days before the election, Biden comes up short. It will be due to his preference for this kind of hunkered down virtual kind of campaigning, as opposed to the kind of campaign that Trump was running, that is having mass rallies, meeting people, getting people together, mobilizing people. The Biden campaign, that wasn't the Biden campaign. So it was my opinion that the enthusiasm gap was characteristic of the Biden campaign and leading up to the election. And so, yeah, I thought the momentum was clearly on the side of Trump and not on the side of Biden. On the Democratic Party, and the larger question that you raised, as you may have heard, the recriminations within the Democratic Party are already beginning, with the so-called moderate faction and critical of the so-called left faction within the Democratic Party. That suggests the possibility of a split within the Democratic Party, which I think would be an advance for progressives in the United States. As Virginia pointed out, the Democratic Party is the graveyard of progressive social movement. That goes back to the 1930s, if not before. We must always remember that the Democratic Party is the party of slave owners. That's its history. And to understand what the Democratic Party is without understanding its roots would be, we'd be in serious political trouble. So there's a possibility that the divisions and the splits and so on, a split may have developed within the Democratic Party, and people who consider themselves to be the left wing within the Democratic Party are going to have to make some hard choices. So I think we have opportunities for real progressive, for real left politics, for real socialist, for real communist politics, if there is indeed a split within the Democratic Party.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that. I'm sure that debate is raging, across the left in America at the moment. And I can see that people have commented in the chat in response to that. We've got a question from Roby, who says, could the right wing and the Democrats drive the DSA, the Democratic Socialists, out of the party? A reminder, if you are watching, please do comment and keep sharing. There's over 600 watching so far. We've got another question from Colin, who's from France, who says, the French media portray Kamala Harris as more left-wing than Biden. What do the panel think about that? I want to come to Paul LeBlanc again, if that's okay. And just following on from what was raised by August, which is, we've seen, haven't we, that in the election, Trump was able to exceed expectations in firing up his working class base. It seems as though, if you look at the polling, that the Democrats weren't able to do so. This is the question I really want to ask Paul. How much do you think the Democrats were able to flip back working class voters that they lost under Obama in some of the swing states and so on? And do you think that it's, can we class Biden as almost a rerun of Clinton 2016? And, does that pose the same problems for the Democrats that they've had since? So I want to ask you that question, Paul.
Well, one thing that, comes to my mind is when we're talking about the working class and the working class vote, we're talking about a lot of people and a lot of different people. And both of the candidates got a lot more votes. So there was a huge turnout in this election campaign. And as August was pointing out, for example, the Black Lives Matter movement, there were lots of whites as well as blacks, and the class composition was working class. That might not be the first identity that they identify themselves as, but a lot of the working class mobilized for Biden. A lot of the Black Lives Matter movement, as Virginia said, came out to vote for Biden against Trump. I think that at the same time, a very high percentage, I saw one figure, 56%, were voting for Biden not because they were crazy about him, but because he wasn't Trump. This was an anti-Trump vote. And Biden doesn't represent a magnetic figure, for people in the working class. I think that at the same time, there are significant numbers of working class people white working class people in particular, who voted for Trump, and there was a racism that was part of their vote, and racist fears and anxieties and so on. And I think Trump played on that, and a lot of those people were crazy for Trump and mobilized for him. I think that Trump presents a stronger figure than Biden, and among his supporters is able to generate much more enthusiasm. I think that the key for us is to push past some of the ways that some of the folks in the media are talking about the working class and the working class vote, see things much more fluid and as something that we can affect and must be working to affect. My major concern when I saw the figures, okay, great, Biden won. So many people voted for Trump. So many people, I think, in my neighborhood, which is a working class neighborhood, and these are not, $100 a year and higher working class. They're in a lower tier, but significant numbers of them were responding to Trump, which means that that's a challenge for those of us on the left. And one of the problems is the left as a whole doesn't have a coherence or a strength or an oomph. The greatest segments of the left that have some coherence and strength are those who've been mobilized by Bernie Sanders and others. The kind of thing that Virginia and August are talking about that we need, that's absolutely true, but that doesn't represent a highly organized sector of the left. So I think we have some challenges ahead of us in order to deal with the kind of question that you're talking about, of how to win more and more of the working class away from the phony answers that are put forward by right-wing demagogues, and around a more class-conscious program, the kind of thing that August and Virginia were emphasizing.
Just on that, on the question of challenges for the left, I want to begin to think, and learning on what the three of you have said about the election result, I want to look forward a bit to what a Biden presidency might look like. Because I mentioned it earlier, but here in Britain, the mainstream media, the liberal centre, politicians of all creeds really are saying that, it's a huge celebration for Biden to win, and they're celebrating this as a return to normal. I saw one Guardian journalist saying that Trump was an aberration and that now society will go back to normal. And, it just illustrates, I think, the lack of explanation about what caused Trump in the first place, about how he was able to build on a deep bitterness and pose as an outsider. Obviously, Biden is very much the darling of the liberal media at the moment. I want to just play a clip of some of the stuff of Biden that we haven't seen as much of recently. If we can get this second clip up here.
Let me be clear. No matter how many lies he tells, I am not banning fracking, period.
We can do this. You can ban chokeholds. But beyond that, you have to teach people how to de-escalate circumstances. De-escalate. So instead of anybody coming at you and the first thing you do is shoot to kill, you shoot them in the leg. There's a way. Paul Ryan was correct when he did the tax code. What's the first thing he decided we had to go after? Social Security and Medicare. Now, we need to do something about Social Security and Medicare. That's the only way you can find room to pay for it.
Well, the uglier side of Joe Biden there, I'm sure he won't be supportive of us showing that. I'd be surprised if he was watching this event tonight, though. But it does raise a question, I think, which is, given Joe Biden's record historically, given his limited program, during the campaign, he distanced himself from Black Lives Matter, didn't commit to Medicare for all, ambiguous about a Green New Deal and so on. I want to come to August and ask, really, what do we think that, what will happen to both the left, but also to Biden supporters, working class Democrat voters, and to Trump's base? What will be the impact of a Biden presidency on those three areas, really? How do we think this might play out? And I want to ask all these questions, if that's okay.
Yeah, well, we shouldn't be surprised that the Biden, another version of the Obama administration. And the dilemma for the left, as it's always been, is the lesser evil. Whether or not they're going to break with the Democratic Party and begin charting a course for an independent working class political action, or if they stay with the Democrats. And what happens oftentimes historically in the United States is that people on the left claim that, okay, once the Dems are in, then we'll put pressure on them to behave correctly. Well, the problem is when the Republicans go after the Democratic incumbent, then that kind of thinking, those people who had that particular view, they feel compelled to come out and to defend the incumbent. That's why Obama was able to get away with all kinds of things. And Clinton, when the Dems are in office, they are able to get away with things that Republicans in office cannot. Progressives will mobilize against the Republicans and not the Democrats, and that's why the Obama administration was again able to do things like ignoring the tragedy that took place in Flint, Michigan. Had McCain or Romney been in office and so on, the progressives would have been out in the streets. But so that's the problem. Whether or not will we really break? I think there will be, won't be a majority, but there will be segments within the left who've been looking to the Dems, who really are won to the perspective of independent working class political action, building a working class party. That's again, I can't emphasize enough the importance of it. That's what our eyes have to be on. And those who are still looking have hope in the Dems. Hope springs eternal for that layer. Yeah, they won't be one to a working class perspective, but there will be those who will. And the main thing is the crisis. We never forget the big picture. The big picture is just crisis, the economic crisis. So we're on the verge of a possible another world depression. That's the framework. That's the framework that we have to begin with, and that reality will force workers to begin to think about radical solutions. We must always remember, though, in a deep economic crisis, when workers start looking for radical solutions, those radical solutions can be on the left as well as the right. And unless the left has its act together, unless we have our own working class political party, those people will inevitably move toward a rightist solution. We should always remember Lenin's insight in 1901, and that is, if the working class does not have its own political party, its act together, when the proverbial shit hits the fan, it's too late. It's too late to try to form a political party in the midst of that kind of turbulence.
I want to touch on two things you just raised there, August, and come to Virginia next, which is one about the big picture, and it links to a bit of a question. Well, it links slightly to a question we've got in the chat here from Vivek, who asks, does Biden's victory signal a revival of the political center? And I know that, right-wing politicians and, centre-ground politicians around the world really were hoping so. I'm sure that Keir Starmer here in Britain with the Labour Party would hope so. But I really want to come to Virginia to ask that question, but also what August finished on there. And it seems that this is the question everyone in the chat wants to know. Most questions we've had on Facebook and YouTube have been asking this. What is the potential now for a new party to the left of the Democrats to be formed? With all the steps forward we've seen on the US left in many ways over the last 5 years, the Black Lives Matter movement, the climate movement, the strikes, the interest in socialist ideas. Virginia, I want to ask you what the prospects now are for the left faced with a Biden presidency.
Yes, so that's a lot. I mean, we just saw today that Mitt Romney is probably being tapped as Secretary of Health and Human Services under Biden. And looking at a list of probable other cabinet members, they do include Republicans, and other than Bernie Sanders, his possible list, is just not that that exciting or uplifting. And I just want to touch back because I saw some of these questions as well around Kamala Harris, and I think this also is an indicator of what we can see with a Biden presidency. I mean, with her being selected as his running mate, it was identity politics at its worst. In order to balance the ticket, it was definitely a form of tokenism. As an Asian woman here in the States, I saw what it was. But if you unpack then the identity politics and look at her record as a public servant, she was a public prosecutor and attorney general for the state of California, where she gained notoriety for basically ruthlessly pursuing so-called law and order policy. She supported a law that would lead to the prosecution of parents of truant children, and that led to some of them facing jail time. She was instrumental in putting nonviolent drug offenders behind bars. She oversaw close to 2,000 marijuana convictions while she served as San Francisco's district attorney. They disproportionately impacted people of color. So I want to take a look about the people who make up the president underneath them, and who fill the cabinets and so on. So I think we need to be realistic there and recognize that it's not just one individual leading the country, but the cabinet members and so on, and what their politics are, starting with Kamala Harris. And you showed very important clips revealing what Biden's true policies are. And I think that leads me to say that we have to realize that unfortunately Trump isn't an aberration. He's a product of everything that is wrong with the capitalist system itself. And this is a system that will resort to racism and sexism and wars to protect itself. So the white nationalist movement will be a problem whether Trump won or not. And they probably are emboldened now. They're angry that he lost. They're emboldened by his words now. So we have to be prepared to respond no matter what. And our members from March 21 in the States have met the Proud Boys in New York and in Portland to stand up against these white nationalists. And that's what's important right now, to be in the streets, building united fronts against fascism and racism. It's going to be critical in this moment, since we know that electoralism and reformism have no ability to defeat these types of evils. It's really only going to be through class struggle and the class learning through that struggle that we're going to see the change that we're talking about now. We just cannot rely on a Biden presidency to bring about these fundamental changes that we're all seeking. And this is, it's through the movements that we see a rebirth of calls for socialism. So certainly the Occupy Wall Street, the climate justice movement, the two Sanders campaigns are expressions of the struggles of the working class in the United States and the crystallizing of anti-capitalist arguments. Like we all saw more recently, the movement for Black Lives demonstrated that ordinary people can regain control of state institutions, even ones that are seemingly as untouchable as the police force. So I think, our role as revolutionary socialists is to continue winning the arguments that movements must break away from believing that a corporate Democrat in the White House will truly end systemic racism and sexism, climate disaster, our mess of a privatized healthcare system, or our unlawful foreign policy. So that is what the focus needs to be on in terms of where our real hope must lie. It can't rely on the Democrats. And it's through the movements that we will push and we will build more progressive and left wings within the capitalist parties. So I do think that we should be supportive of the squad, of AOC, and of progressive reform ballot measures like the Fight for 15. But it is through building that movement that we will do that along the way and gain important reformist victories. But the fundamental changes that we need to see, we cannot rely on electoralism, and we can't rely on politicians, and we certainly cannot rely on the capitalist Democrats.
It's important you say that, Virginia, and I'm going to ask you to hang around. I know you have another meeting soon, but I will come back to you one last time. The question of prioritizing struggles over, electoral avenues, as a lot of, the Democratic Socialists of America and so on have done, I think rings true, because, even here in Britain, we have lots of discussions around, now that Jeremy Corbyn's been suspended and Keir Starmer runs a Labour Party, do we need a new electoral or a new left-wing party in Britain? And I think what you say about, the importance of struggle and mass movements as a way to do that, I think is something we can all remember. I'm going to come back to you, Virginia, but before you go, I want to bring Paul LeBlanc back in, because I know Paul wants to come in on this point. The questions of the strength of the political centre and the possibilities of a mass left political party, it seems to me are key ones at the moment. What are your thoughts on this, Paul?
Yeah, one thing that I raised and August repeated in his remarks, I think we can't afford to lose track of, and that is that there are larger crises that have been developing that are not going to go away. At the moment, Biden has a certain credibility in some circles. And there are some people, certainly in the leadership of the Democratic Party, they want there to be a revival of the political center. But the larger crises are going to continue to cause the right wing to grow in reaction. it creates possibility for the growth of the left. And it will be something that will quickly lead to the bankruptcy of centrists and liberals in the Democratic Party leadership, the liberal, corporate liberal elite, because they do not have answers to these questions. They don't have solutions. They have rhetoric, but not much else. I think that it's going to be a tougher row to hoe to build the kind of left that we need in order to, for example, establish a mass working class party. Somebody had asked the question, could Sanders have won the election? And if he had won the election, if he had been the candidate, and if he had somehow won the election, and I think it's possible he could have, but not for sure. But then what? There is not a mass socialist base in the United States that could support and back up and push for even the mild social democratic perspectives that Sanders was articulating. There's an interesting interview with AOC in the New York Times in which she says that it's been a hard 2 years for her. She says, externally, we've been winning. Externally, there's been a ton of support for things like the Green New Deal and Medicare for All and so forth. But internally, that means inside of the Democratic Party, it's been extremely hostile to anything that even smells progressive. And she elaborates on this, and we can see it in some of the newspaper reports, the attacks by centrist liberals and corporate liberal elites from the Democratic Party on the left in the Democratic Party. I agree with what August is saying and Virginia, that a key must be building non-electoral struggles, building socialist consciousness, that kind of thing. That is essential for any kind of electoral advance by the left. And it's going to take time to build the socialist base that we need, that would have the capacity to win elections, not within the Democratic Party, but on its own. There's a possibility of that, I think, possibility over the next decade. It's not something that is going to come together, I don't think, within the next 2 or 3 years. It's going to take time and struggle and a lot of work by many of us.
Well, it's been a fascinating discussion so far. We've just hit the hour mark. I'm going to begin to wrap things up. I want to come to each of the panelists in turn, really, for a final word, or well, a final 2 minutes each. We've had lots of comments tonight, over 600 people watching, people from Britain, people from the US and so on, lots of questions coming in. One of the key ones is about where the left goes now. And I'm going to turn to August first. August, in 2 minutes, in a word or sentences or whatever, what do you think lies ahead? What are the struggles we have to prepare ourselves for? And where does the left go from here?
Okay, in 2 minutes. I begin with the premise that the only way the capitalists can solve this crisis is on the backs of working people. That's the premise I began with. The only solution to this crisis is on the backs of working people, which means that the working class will be pushed, will be forced into politics, onto the center stage of politics, reluctantly maybe, but the working class will be forced to have to be political and to begin looking for radical solutions. And unless there is a working class party in place, prepared, in order to channel all of that righteous anger in a constructive fashion, then we know what can happen. That's what the lessons of the 1930s taught us. When we don't have a political party in place to channel all of that righteous anger. And so, yes, independent working class political action is crucial. The problem with voting, I've come up with a term, I think it's original, called voting fetishism. Yes, that's a problem. that's a problem. But we have to again look to the working class, and much of the left progressives have to overcome their stereotypes. There are stereotypes about the working class, that the working class is inherently racist. No. Believe me, I'm old enough to tell people how much has changed in the United States and the opportunities that we have today that we haven't had today. So yes, my brief comments is that yes, the working class will be forced onto the center stage of politics, and unless progressives have in place the kind of political party to channel that righteous anger when it begins to develop. No one can predict how long it will take and so on, but unless we are there, unless we have absorbed to our bones what Lenin taught us, that if we don't have a revolutionary party in place, it's too late to try to build one in the middle of the turbulence.
Fascinating, August, and I'm glad you ended on a note of optimism there. Really, that we can fight racism within the working class, and that the working class will be thrust on to the stage of history. We just have to be ready when it is. I'm going to come to Paul next. Paul LeBlanc in Pittsburgh. In a word, or in 2 minutes, like August did, where do we go from here? Where does the left go from here, and what are the battles ahead?
Well, one thing is we need to continue to be involved in the various social struggles, and it's hard to know exactly what's going to be coming up. I wouldn't have predicted the amazing upsurge of Black Lives Matter activists. I wouldn't have been prepared to predict the Occupy movement. But the situation that we're living in is going to generate a number of struggles, and we have to be involved in those, and involved not just with our own little groups, but involved in mass struggles, working with other people, learning from other people. One of the things that we do not have right now are cadres, people who have an understanding of what's what and can do more than just talk, who can organize meetings, and out of such meetings organize campaigns and struggles and help teach other people to do that and work together in a national coordinated fashion. We do not have that kind of organization. And therefore, until we do, I'm very pessimistic about how far the left can go. But in order to create such an organization, right now there are people who exist in various little groups, various relatively little groups. There's DSA, it's got 60,000 members, but it's fairly incoherent, and essentially there are little currents and countercurrents within. And then there are significant numbers of relatively independent activists who have been playing an amazing role in some of the mass struggles, certainly the Black Lives Matter movement and others. So there's got to be a cross-fertilization, there's got to be discussion, there's got to be a number of us working together with a perspective of, over the next few years, attempting to pull together the kind of revolutionary party that August was talking about, revolutionary organization. It doesn't exist right now. There's no existing organization where we can say, there's the one, and that's going to grow into what we need. We have to forge that within the struggle, while helping to spread socialist consciousness and deepen socialist consciousness among more and more people, and work for the crystallization then of revolutionary socialist organizations that are coherent and effective, and as part of that, building not only mass non-electoral struggles, but a mass left party, mass working class party. I anticipate that's going to take several years, but that's the kind of trajectory that I'm seeing that I think we need to be working on now and discussing with each other now.
Very interesting. Thank you, Paul. Finally, the final word will go to Virginia. Virginia, where do you see this going? The question of struggle, of resistance to Trump and the far right, resistance to 4 years of Biden, and what can the revolutionary left do now?
Well, thanks again, Louis, for having me. Thanks to SWP and my fellow speakers. Unfortunately and incredibly, I think it's the same battles and struggles that we'll be standing against and participating in, whether it had been Trump or Biden. As August said in the beginning of this meeting, economic justice and the basic needs of the mass of the American working class will still be at the heart of the struggle, because the Democrats aren't a class of the working people, but that of the capitalists. So we'll always be railing against economic injustice under either of the capitalist parties. We heard, Kamala Harris and Joe Biden will not ban fracking. They won't abolish the police. Obama deported more people than Trump and kept families in cages. And Biden has stated that his administration won't separate families in cages, but doesn't intend to stop caging them as Obama had. So in California, there's going to be a statewide day of action for immigrant justice being planned on November 14th. And the organizers recognize the power of ordinary people in the streets. They're not waiting to see whether those who got elected will do anything to protect immigrants. Their statements include, we know that neither the Democrats nor the Republicans will ever free them all, abolish ICE, close the camps, unless we make them. So no matter who wins the presidential election, Californians were demanding freedom even before the election for every last person currently being held in detention. March 21 members were leading this type of organizing, and this is the type of work that must continue. As Paul said, we're not going to win much as individuals, as tiny groups. So we have to continue pulling folks away from the capitalist frameworks and analyses, building our groups like March 21 and movements like the Movements for Black Lives, building united fronts against racism and fascism, and making international connections like these discussions right now. So we need each and every one of you watching to join with us. And I encourage you to join the Socialist Workers' Party if you haven't already, to join us in March 21 if you're in the States, to stay in touch, and let's build an international movement together. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Virginia. I'm afraid that brings an end to what has been a fascinating discussion. I wish we could go on all night or all afternoon for our speakers in the States. But I want to thank everyone who's tuned in. We've had over 600 people watching. We've had lots of comments in the chat. And obviously a big thank you to our three panelists, to August, who's joined us from Minnesota, to Paul, who's joined us from Pittsburgh, and to Virginia, who's joined us from Baltimore. And I just want to leave everyone with two quick things. The first is to say that we live in tumultuous times. We live in chaotic times. And it's important in times like these that we arm ourselves with the political arguments, that we educate ourselves so that we can best agitate. And reading is an important part of that. And socialist bookshops are an important part of that. And I know that Christmas is coming up and people might be buying gifts for friends, for family, and so on. I want to encourage people to visit Bookmark's bookshop, the Socialist bookshop, to do this. Do not give your money to Amazon, to Jeff Bezos, because he doesn't really need any more money, let's face it. Give your money to an independent socialist bookshop like Bookmark's, and please do get your presents there. Before I leave everyone, I just want to echo the point that Virginia finished with. We face a world of pandemic, of climate change, of racism, of war, and the rich want to make us pay for it. It's more important than ever when you look at the US election that we fight for a different kind of politics, a politics that can break from the racism of someone like Trump and from the corporatism of someone like Joe Biden. We talked tonight about the need for struggle, about the need for mass movements, and about the need for organization. In the Socialist Workers' Party, we're not the finished article. We're by no means perfect, but we are trying to build an organization based on struggle, based on solidarity, and based on socialism. If you want to be part of that project, do think about joining us. There's a link in the comments, and there should be a link running at the bottom of your screen about how to do that. And with that, I'm going to bring to close what has been a fantastic evening, a brilliant discussion, and to remind everyone to stay safe, to stay socialist, and to stay in the struggle as well. Thanks to our three speakers, and thanks to everyone who has watched at home.
Thank you.